Folks, I wonder how your week feels. Generally, as your weeks go week by week, how does your week feel? Is your week really busy? Is it cram-packed full of appointments, and is there a big, long to-do list as you start the week? Or maybe on the other end of the scale, actually, is your week, is it fairly leisurely? Have you got maybe quite an open week, an empty week, where you can pick and choose what you might do, or you can decide for yourself? But do you find yourself crawling toward the weekend in desperate need of a break? You know, a day or two off from the daily grind. I don't know, maybe the weekend actually for you, though, might actually be a bit of an inconvenience. It's that thing that gets in the way of doing what you really, really love. It's that thing that gets in the way of working. I wonder how you feel that, though, in your body. How do you physically feel that? As the week goes on and you creep closer and closer to Friday, do you feel yourself more and more tired and weary and drained? Does 5 days of working 9 to 5 or whatever it may be for you, does it feel like it takes its toll on you? And then come Friday evening, you just want to kick back, get Netflix on, get the Chinese in, and just sit back and chill. It's been interesting over the last number of years. There's been a number of these high-performing global corporate businesses. They've done a bit of experimenting with the number of days they ask their employees to work. And then again, a lot of smaller startups are doing this as well. And more of them are moving to the idea of a 4-day week. Maybe, does anyone actually work for a company that gives you a 4-day week? If you do, come and have a chat with Clive afterwards. Because I work for him, and it wouldn't be the worst thing. But interestingly, it seems to have been a fairly positive response so far. But if you were to jump way back in time and go back to 1793, France, in an effort to increase human productivity, they decided that they were going to change the way that people worked and rested completely. And what they did in 1793 was on a national scale. They changed and modified the 7-day week, and they changed it to a 10-day week. I wonder what does that make you feel, the thought of a 10-day week? So you'd have worked 9 days, and then you would have had 1 day off. And they even went to the extent of changing their clocks and their calendars and their rhythms around this so that people would be able to be more productive and so that they would produce more and more and more. And I guess if you've ever been to France, in recent years, you'll understand and you'll know that clearly didn't work back in the 1700s. It didn't end well. As a result of the changes, they found that actually the opposite was happening. People were burning out. They were becoming less productive. And actually even suicide rates were skyrocketing at that time as well. So you see, as it turns out, we were not designed to work 9 days and rest 1. But I also want to just say that actually, when we delve into the Bible, I want to suggest that we weren't designed to work for 4 days and to rest for 3 either. But rather, there is a rhythm which has been designed and created for us to flourish, which is 6 days of work and 1 day of rest. This is the design that is set out for us in Genesis. It's the created order. And one person puts it like this, that if you go against the grain of the universe, you're going to get splinters. So tonight we're thinking about this 4th commandment. That's where we're in tonight. I'm going to read it for us. It should come up on the screen, I think. Possibly. Yeah, there we go. So starting in chapter 8, this is in the book of Exodus. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. Now this topic of Sabbath, it is really, really quite big. And to be honest, we could easily make this topic like a 5-part series. But the time that we have tonight, all I want to do is I want to touch on a few important areas and ask a few important questions of Sabbath. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by just taking a few moments to think, well, what is Sabbath? And then we're going to move to actually ask, well, why does Sabbath matter to us today, here in the 21st century? Why is it so important? I would really love to then delve into how do we Sabbath? How do we do that well? Now, I'm going to lean on the fact that we don't have a lot of time tonight, but if I'm perfectly honest with you, I am wrestling with this. How do we do this well? How do we do this in our different circumstances well? Personally, how do I do this well when I work for a church, when I'm busy on a Sunday, when I've got 3 little boys who are just bundles of energy on a Saturday looking after them? How do I navigate this and how do I do it? So when I figure that out, and I am trying my best, believe me, I'm leaning into this here in this season, then we'll have the next part of the sermon as to how do we Sabbath. So what is Sabbath? Well, verse 8 tonight actually states it really clearly to start with. It says, Sabbath is holy. Sabbath is holy. It's a day that is to be set apart and protected as a holy day. Now, that's not to say that every other day in the week is not holy. That's not to say that kind of we get to clock off on a Sunday night and then we get to kind of go about our business and we can do whatever sinning we want from Monday through to Saturday and then we rein it back in again on the Sunday. That's not what it's about, but it is a holy day that is unique. It is set apart. It's a day unto the Lord in a way that is somewhat different to others. And when we think of that creation story way back in Genesis, I find it really interesting that the very first thing that God declares as holy is a day. The first thing that the Lord declares as holy is a day. Now, it would maybe make sense if you were to assume that after God created the universe and creating the world and everything in it, it would make sense that for you to assume that then he would go and create a holy place. A particular geographical point or a mountain or a spring, that's where God would maybe establish a holy sanctuary. But the Bible shows us in Genesis that what God does first is he creates a holy time. A holy time. And time is so much the very essence of what Sabbath is about. Now, there's this Jewish scholar called Abraham Joshua Heschel, and he's done some incredible work on the Sabbath. And he describes the Sabbath as a sanctuary in time. And he uses this beautiful metaphor to lean into the area of Sabbath. He calls Sabbath like a cathedral in time. Has anybody here ever been to a cathedral before? Hands up, you've been to cathedral? Yes, there's lots of us have all been to cathedrals. You've been to St. Anne's? You should go to St. Anne's. It's lovely. It's beautiful. You walk in and it's just, you see how big it is, and then there's that is amazing, the spike that you see from the outside, and then you see it from the inside. And I don't know if there's an actual term for what that is, but in theory it is a big, massive spike. But it's beautiful. It's stunning. But has anybody ever been to Sagrada Familia in Barcelona? Yeah, if you're lucky enough to have ever got to that, it is incredible. There's a picture of it here. Look at that. They've been building this for 140 years, and only now have they got an end date for when they think this will all be finally complete. You arrive at this place, and it's utterly breathtaking. This ginormous building, not even finished yet, and its size, its intricacy, the stonework, the details, its shape and its structure, it's all just mesmerizing and breathtaking. But now the design of a cathedral is always done in such a way that when you walk into it, your eyes are lifted upwards. Imagine going to the Sagrada Familia and you arrive at this beautiful building and you walk in and you spend the time looking at your feet, or looking at your shoes, or looking at the stones that you're walking on. That's just not what would happen. You're overcome with the building and your eyes are lifted upwards. You see, it's intended to encourage a bodily experience of lifting your eyes actually up to the Lord. To cast your minds upwards to the heavens and to the things of God. Now, of course, a cathedral in its own right maybe doesn't have the power to do that, but the intent of the designer is there at least. And with Sabbath, we find a day in our weekly rhythm that is set aside, holy and sacred, which goes beyond simply taking a day off work. But it's actually a day where we get to step away from our normal rhythm, and we get to cast our minds, our bodies, our spirits, and our souls unto the Lord. We get to gaze upon him, and we get to remember what he has done. Forgive me, I've just jumped a wee bit there, unfortunately. Way back to the start. So, Sabbath is holy, it's set apart, and it's sacred. Now look, there's lots and lots and lots that we could go into and unpack of what Sabbath is, but I want the chunk of our evening to be spent looking at why do we Sabbath? Why should we do this here today? And I guess a good place to start is by looking at what does Jesus have to say about Sabbath. And here's a little giveaway. Jesus is pro-Sabbath. He is for Sabbath. And we've got this amazing passage in Mark chapter 2 where it says, starting in verse 23, it should come up on the screen as well. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields. As his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you ever read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions." Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Now, the backdrop here is that clearly the culture, and in that time, Sabbath had held a very different position than within the daily life than what it might do for us in our culture today. But just like us today, those people, like us, they had received these 10 commandments, which clearly laid out in that fourth commandment that Sabbath was to be practiced, it was to be kept, it was to be remembered, it was to be a holy day. Now, if you were a devout Jew in those days and you wanted to live a life of obedience to those 10 commandments, there was naturally going to be an interesting conversation that would have taken place after receiving this fourth commandment for Sabbath. And it would probably have gone something like this. What do you reckon God means by work? I don't know. What do you reckon he means by rest? I don't know. Do you reckon you can go for a run on the Sabbath? But then you might sweat, that might be work. No, yeah. Do you reckon I could prepare a big meal on the Sabbath? Oh, it just depends. For me, that's work, but for this person, it might be work. What about the dishes on Sabbath? Can you do dishes on Sabbath? And I see a bunch of these are like, "Amen, don't be doing dishes on Sabbath. That's work. That's definitely work." It's a natural conversation, I guess, to have. So what the Pharisees and the leaders and the teachers of the Jewish tradition did way back then was they took this law and they built a fence around it. Now think of it like this. It's like when you go to the zoo, when you go see the elephants, you go to the elephant enclosure, you see the elephants there, but you're only allowed to go so far because there's a fence or there's a railing. You can't get close because if you got any closer, you would be at risk of hurting yourself or doing something that actually you should not be doing. And it was kind of like that in theory. The Jewish leaders metaphorically set up this society in a way that built a fence around these laws with hundreds and hundreds of other little more detailed laws so that they would not creep close to breaking the law that God had given them. So when it came to Sabbath, there was hundreds of these mini man-made laws. They later were known as the Mishnah. They were laws for how far you could walk, laws for your animals, what they were allowed to do. There was laws for what sort of food you were allowed to prepare. It covered everything, absolutely everything. And into that backdrop, Jesus makes this whole claim that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And for those who were there at that time listening to Jesus, the stinger would have come from this little part, the part that said, "Not man for the Sabbath." Translation, Jesus was saying, guys, you've got it wrong here. You've got it backwards. You've turned this incredible gift of God into a legalistic, soul-sucking, rule-fueled day. But arguably, whenever we hear Jesus' words today, the stinger actually comes in the first part of the verse. The Sabbath was made for man. It was designed and created. It was tailor fit for you, for humanity, for our soul. You see, we, for the most part, we struggle with the opposite of the Pharisees. It's not that we have a Sabbath day that is super legalistic and it's littered with rules of what we can and cannot do, but rather it's actually that we generally don't have any rules at all, or at least very few for the majority. We could be a Christian and not practice Sabbath at all. We could be a Christian and we could simply maybe refer to Sabbath as just a day of work. Now, immediately after this passage that we have there, goes to chapter 3 in the book of Mark, and it says this. Another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and jumped for joy, praising God, celebrating his goodness, because a man had been healed that day. Jokes. It's not what happened. They began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus because of what had just happened. You know that interestingly, the majority, not all of, but the majority of Jesus' healings took place on the Sabbath. I don't think that's a coincidence. I genuinely don't believe that that's a mistake. The Sabbath is a day for healing. Not just for for physical healing, but not just for physical healing, but emotional healing, for spiritual healing. It's a day of rest, but in a very real sense, it's a day of restoration. And as we slow down and as we cease the hustle and the hurry, and as we deliberately and consciously set aside anxiety and worry and stress for that one day, we give ourselves over to the one who has created a day within our weekly rhythm that was designed for us, for our benefit, for our flourishing, for our soul to be nourished by the goodness of God. So why Sabbath? Well, to start with, because Jesus is for Sabbath, and he teaches in his actions and in his words that Sabbath is for you. Secondly, I'm going to have to go a little bit quicker here, but Sabbath in itself is actually an act of resistance. In Exodus, we've got this command, like we read tonight, it's being given in it. You can see how it's anchored in this Genesis narrative. It's anchored in that creation story, that rhythm that God designed and that rhythm that God practiced himself in the creation account. But a wee bit later on in the book of Deuteronomy, we've got Moses giving the people his last almost like this last big sermon before he was about to die. And he gives them the 10 Commandments once again. But this time, the commandment isn't anchored in the Genesis account in creation. It's actually anchored in the fact that the Israelites were set free from Egypt. So he gives the command, he gives the fourth command, and then he says, "Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." You see, for the Israelites, Egypt was the opposite of everything that Sabbath was about. Egypt was about work, 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 work. It was slave labor. It was build, build, build. They had cities that were built purely for the purpose of having storehouses to keep more possessions, more materials, more foods. Everything that Egypt stood for was about gaining and consuming more and more. And into that context, Moses says, do not forget the Sabbath. You must not go back to the way things were in Egypt. You've been rescued from that. You've been redeemed from that. You've been delivered from that. And now you've got a different rhythm to live in, a different rhythm of time where you work 6, but then you have to cease for 1. You've got to down tools. You've got to change the rhythm. You've got to change the mindset. And the thing is, as we look around the world today, genuinely, the spirit of Egypt is still very much alive. I mean, you could cast your mind to the big cities of London or over in America and New York, but you don't have to even go that far. You don't even have to go to a city. Go to the villages of our own country. Like you can see that spirit of needing to do more and more and more is driving the culture, urging us to gain more wealth, pile up more possessions, to work harder and harder, to do more, not to stop, not to cease, to keep going and to keep gaining. Therefore, today, in the 21st century, for us to stop 1 day a week is an act of resistance to that very spirit. It's a way of surrendering all of those things over to God and saying, Lord, none of this is above you. You are Lord over it all. Sabbath is resistance. Not only is Sabbath for us, not only is Sabbath resistance, but I want to say that Sabbath is witness. Sabbath is witness. There was once a missionary called Alpheus Paget Wilkes. I think there's a picture of him going to come up on the screen as well. Anybody ever heard of Alpheus Paget Wilkes? I hadn't. Good. I wasn't the only one. But he was a missionary way back in the 1800s. It was the guy in the middle, what a name as well, by the way, Alpheus Paget Wilkes. In the 1800s, left everything he owned and he moved over to Japan in the hope of reaching the lost there. So when he arrived, he found that he was struggling. Actually, he was really struggling to connect his message to the indigenous locals. And after a while, he discovered that the Japanese people there that he was working with, they had this real inner, deep apprehension about what came after death. It consumed their mind, it consumed their thoughts and their conversations. So what Wilkes did was he decided that his strategy would be to preach the gospel in a way that emphasized the scriptures that dealt with resurrection and eternal life. And as a result, countless Japanese came to faith. And the indigenous Japanese church today actually can still trace its roots back to the missionary Wilkes. And then there's also this guy here. This is Charles Finney. She come up on the screen as well. You've maybe heard of Charles Finney. Charles Finney played an amazingly important role in the spread of the Christian faith through North America. And one of Charles Finney's key evangelistic methods was known as the anxious seat. The anxious seat. And it came from Finney recognizing that one of the biggest anxieties people faced in that time, way back in the late 1700s, was this real anxiety of this idea of standing before God. This anxiety of bearing it all before the Creator. So what Finney would have done was, at the end of his tent prayer meetings, he would invite people to come up to the front where they would sit in a chair known as the anxious seat. And here in this seat, they would receive prayer and they would confess Jesus as Lord over their anxiety. And from this, countless people would respond. And actually, the records show how this was part of one of the greatest revivals known across North America. Now, here's the thing. Here's why I'm telling you all this here. Both Wilkes and Finney, what they did was they listened to the people. They understood the culture that they were speaking into, and the gospel that they shared spoke to the real, felt needs of the people at that time. Now, the message was the same. The message didn't change. The message, the gospel message, is eternal, but the method was very, very specific. I want to suggest that today, in the 21st century, particularly in the Western world, we have our own context. And the stats show that people are weary, people are exhausted, they are tired, they are constantly connected to work, constantly on the reachable, constantly feeling the pressure to need to do more, to get more, to become more. But the very rest that the gospel offers is the rest that the world is crying out for. It's the rest that is found in Jesus. It's the rest that is found in what Jesus urges towards as well in Sabbath. It's deep rest. It's soul rest. It's spirit rest. It's not just a day off. It's not even actually just a week's holiday somewhere, or it's not just a yearly retreat. It's a weekly rhythm of putting down the tools and delighting in the Lord. Like, can you imagine? Just imagine what it would be like. What would happen if the church modeled this so well to the world? Surely people would take notice. Surely people would ask questions. And maybe it would draw some towards Jesus, the one who said, "Come to me, all who are weary, and I will give you rest." Sabbath is for us. Sabbath is resistance. And Sabbath is also a witness to a weary world. And look, tonight, to be honest, I want to say this as well as we're coming to finish. Work isn't the enemy, okay? Work is not the enemy. And it might come across that way from what I've said, and I hope not, but work is not the enemy. Because the thing is, God is the Lord of your rest, but He is also the Lord of your work. Work is good. Work's as much a part of God's design for us as human beings as Sabbath is. There was work in the garden, and there is going to be work in the new heavens and the new earth. But work is not allowed to become our God. It's not allowed to become our God, and Sabbath is so helpful in protecting us from that. And you know, there's a good chance that if we have allowed work to become our God, then there's a good chance that rest is going to feel like a sin. If we have allowed work to become our God, then rest is going to feel like a sin. If the thought of having a day every week where you're not allowed to log on to your emails, or you're not allowed to check in with your workmates, or whatever it might be, whatever it might look like, if that feels a little bit like like it's a bit of a knot in your stomach, or it just doesn't sit right, then we have to jump back 2 weeks ago when we talked about the second commandment, where God said we cannot put anything before Him. We cannot have idols. We cannot worship other gods. And this is a spiritual discipline. And we are commanded to follow them. But maybe you're here tonight and actually you've never taken that step to follow Jesus. You wouldn't identify as a Christian. You wouldn't call yourself a Christian. You wouldn't say you have a personal relationship with Jesus. So maybe you're sitting here being like, that's all well and good, Reuben, but look, that doesn't really apply to me. So I'm just going to go and I'm going to work and I'm going to do my thing. If you don't know Jesus, but if you do know weariness, if you don't know Jesus, but you do know a longing for peace, if you don't know Jesus, but you do know a sense of discontent or unfulfillment, no matter how much you gain or no matter how much money you get in the bank, no matter what experiences that you can have, if that's you tonight, then let me tell you, long before I would ever want to point you towards a practice, I want to introduce you to a person. And it's that person who was never in a hurry, who wasn't rushed. He's that person that actually said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. It's Jesus, the Son of God, the one who came to pay the price, the greatest price ever paid, to set you free from sin and death, to set you free from a life that strives towards fulfillment and joy by relentlessly pursuing more and more, working without ceasing. Tonight, Jesus invites you to come to Him, to find true, fulfilled rest for your body, but for your soul, for your spirit. He is for you tonight. Sabbath is for you. Sabbath is resistance. And Sabbath is witness. And Jesus is for you if you have not received Him this evening. I want to pray. And then we're going to move into a time of ministry and worship.